Welcome to episode 156 of Silver Lining for Learning. I'm Chris Dede with Harvard University. I'm joined by co-host Punya Mishra from Arizona State and Kurt Bonk from the University of Indiana. And we are very excited to have this program on preparing children in Africa for a fast-changing world. One of the things that we've talked about extensively already in the series is the impacts of generative AI, but also just many other things happening in the world in terms of what outcomes children need from education. And the fact that generative AI does really well on high-stakes tests. So if we're using high-stakes tests as our measure of effectiveness, then we're preparing students to lose to artificial intelligence in life. So it's very exciting to look at what's happening in Africa in terms of thinking about outcomes. Sometimes these are called global competencies, sometimes preparation for the digital economy. People have many different terms for it, but we have three experts today from the African region who are going to talk about what's going on in their countries and also what the role of nonprofits might be. And I'm indebted to one of our alumni, Shirley Edey, who was my student and who has put together this show. So Shirley, why don't you start by introducing yourself and then you can popcorn it to one of the other guests.
Great, thanks, Chris. And thanks everyone for having us. It is a topic that's it's been really close to my heart, and I know same with Salome and Hannah. And it's really been gaining a lot of traction. This idea of breadth of skills, 21st century skills. I think anyone who's interested in education would have been involved in the conversation in one way or another. So I'm based in South Africa. I consult to an organization called the National Education Collaboration Trust. And I've run their innovation team for the last 6 years or so. And a big part of that work was exploring what does innovation look like in basic education. So when we say basic education in South Africa, it's from early childhood development to grade 12. And sort of exploring innovation within schools, right from blue sky innovation to more incremental innovation. And one of the big themes that came through during this time was this idea of being much more deliberate and systematic about developing, whether you want to call them 21st century skills or breadth of skills or social emotional learning. And we started doing more and more research. So a bit of secondary research, but a bit of primary research in what we call the sandbox schools. And over time started making contributions to the Ministry of Education here at the Department of Basic Education. So my role now, having walked this path with the ministry and with the National Education Collaboration Trust, is to work from within the ministry in thinking about how can a country like South Africa, with the tensions and challenges and opportunities and paradoxes in the country that we live in, how can we start to be way more deliberate and systematic about developing a breadth of skills? We know that our kids are going to be leaving school needing a set of transversal skills that can run across a range of environments, and particularly fast-changing environments. So that's been the focus of my work. And today I'd love to share a little bit about how the Ministry of Education in South Africa is thinking about this work and what some of their progress is. I will popcorn it over to Hannah.
Yes, hello, everybody. My name is Hannah Yoshimoto. I'm the Chief of Education at UNICEF South Africa at the moment. Our portfolio currently focuses on early childhood development, the quality of education, and youth skills development. But previously, I served as the Regional Chief of Education at UNESCO for a few years. And before then, I was also a Chief of Education with UNICEF in Egypt and Somalia. I also worked at more of an education-oriented department at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. in the past. So today I would like to, I really emphasize this interest in the transferable skills, which really is relevant because whatever we're teaching the young people for the future, what's the fundamental competencies needed? Because whatever we teach, it's probably going to change in the next 10 years again. So what is it that the core needs are? And today, partly because of my experience in the Middle East and Northern Africa region, it would be great if I could inject some of the cross-regional experiences to this conversation. Thank you.
And Salome.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity, and hi everyone. My name is Salome Wenya. I am from Kenya, where I serve as a civil servant. I am the Regional Director, Quality Assurance and Standards in Nairobi. Nairobi is the region that hosts the capital city for the entire country. So much of what we do in the country emanates from that region. My main daily work concerns ensuring quality education across the levels, right from pre-primary through to primary, secondary, and nowadays we even have junior secondary education all the way to TTCs, that is teachers training colleges. Now, in terms of what we are doing here, I would say we are on the right track. We reformed our curriculum. We now have competency-based curriculum where the focus is on core competencies, that is the need to acquire the 7 core competencies. And one of the core competencies that we are keen on is digital literacy. And in terms of digital literacy, we are having it as a learning area that is given across the levels, all the way from preschool to the university. At the same time, we are encouraging our teachers to infuse even as they undertake the other learning.
Salome, you're breaking up a little. Why don't you turn off your video? And I think that will help with bandwidth.
Okay, let me try that. What about that? Is it clear
That's
there?
better. That's better.
Okay. So then, as I was explaining, that in terms of the government, we are encouraging that every department does use of ICT to just be able to empower everyone along the system. Then we have also introduced the learning component on coding in addition to computer studies. We also undertake learners' challenges in ICT, what we are calling entrepreneurial challenges using ICT. We also have emphasis on STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, where we have our inset centers where the teachers are given additional skills as they continue doing their daily deliveries. We have also set up a center for training teachers, building their capacities. It's like a center of excellence in terms of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There is so much that is also happening at KICD. KICD is Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development, where if we need any teaching resource or where we need to confirm about the content of facts in education, you simply Google on our education cloud and you'll be able to access the information. So in addition to that, we also run a curriculum that we refer to as co-curricular activities. One of the areas in co-curricular activities is science fair. In science fair, learners are encouraged with the guidance of the teachers to participate in different innovations, then showcase at different levels, and that is done right from the lowest level of administrative unit, running through until we get to the national level, and the best team is always awarded. I think in a snapshot, that's what we are doing in our country, Kenya. Thank you so much, and back to you.
Well, I'm really excited by what I'm hearing, and one of the things I'm hearing is this emphasis on competencies and skills as opposed to content knowledge. And of course, that's a huge problem in education now, that kids are learning content just as facts. And those are things that can be looked up on the internet in 5 seconds. So it's not as if you have to have those facts at your fingertips. And yet, because it's easy to test, many countries are still sticking with content knowledge as the measure of whether or not teachers in schools are doing well. So when you, this is a question really for any and all of you, how is your country judging the effectiveness of education in terms of communicating these competencies to students?
If I were to answer that question, I would say we are trying, we have just started, but for us, at where we are, a lot of information is being circulated to create awareness so that we have the ownership from the entire populace. And a lot of research is also being undertaken. Capacity building is also ongoing continuously in session and out of session. And a lot of publication in terms of communicating to whoever is supposed to receive the information is also happening. So to us in Kenya, we are seeing this as a real transformation, and we are looking forward for the fruits of transforming the entire education system. Because at every level, we are very keen on ensuring that we get what we are referring to as a citizen, an empowered, an engaged, and an ethical citizen. That's being the vision for our education. And then the mission statement declares that we need to facilitate exploitation or nurturing of each learner's potential. So with that kind of approach, everyone knows at whatever level, are you dropping out? Are you clearing education at grade 3? Is it grade 4? Whichever level you are coming off, the key word is, are you competent? Thank you, and back to you.
Shirley, what about in South Africa?
So Chris, in South Africa, we're still very much in development stage and phase. So it's a critical question, the one that you ask, and it's probably one of the trickier ones. You know, how do we start to understand what progress looks like in the development of these competencies? How do we report on them at the learner level? How does that reporting look different to what assessment and reporting has looked like in terms of assessing content and knowledge? And you know, our current system is almost entirely set up to support and measure and report on the development of knowledge. But we've made very little process in being deliberate about measuring and assessing these competencies. We have learned quite a lot from UNICEF, life skills and citizenship education work that's been happening in the region. And we're currently embarking on a sort of an analysis of what is the latest thinking in measuring and assessing 21st century skills and competencies. And because what you'll find is if you start scratching around, there's a huge amount of progress that's been made just in the last 4 or 5 years. So we're hoping that we can make some progress quite quickly once the country is ready to start being more deliberate about assessing these skills. For now, the focus locally has been on developing a sort of an organizing framework or a guiding framework that can help us to Number one, visualize and prioritize the competencies that the country deems as important and we should be developing in our learners. I can share a little bit more about that if you're interested. And the framework is there also to help to start to pull through alignment from curriculum through to assessment, through to pedagogies and teacher development, and then through to the learning environment. So what's interesting is you see that we've got currently a lot of these competencies are shared in our curriculum, but kind of in the preamble, in the introduction, where we talk in a lovely but somewhat lofty way about our purposes and aims. So it reads really nicely, and it's really aligned with a lot of these skills that we know are crucial. But what you see is that they don't pull through into the actual taught curriculum in the classroom, in the pedagogies that we know develop these types of competencies. And then they certainly aren't pulled through to assessment and reporting. So this competency framework is something that the country is working on, and the department has taken a really collaborative approach to developing the framework. They have spent for the last year and a half a lot of time consulting local stakeholders. What do we think are important? What do we think our kids need when we leave school, knowing how little we know about the future and knowing how little we know about the rate of change? How are our kids going to navigate that? So the department has had consultations with a range of stakeholders, from the private sector and business to teachers and labor unions, to kids in our schools, to kids with disabilities, to unemployed youth, to the higher ed institutions, and the list goes on. They've also done an analysis of, if anyone's been interested in this space, there are a ton of frameworks out there on 21st century skills and competencies. So they've done an analysis of these different frameworks to get a sense of them. And there was a temptation at one point to just adopt one of the big frameworks that were out there. But we realized that there's this tension that it's almost one needs to be inherently local. Although there's a huge universality around these skills, there's a lot of agreement around which of these skills are important. There's some elements to each of these frameworks that make them unique and make them local. And it was that the country was looking for. And so the department has gone through this process of developing this framework, and it's still in draft format. And the hope is that once there's some agreement on this, that we can start to get really deliberate now about sort of looking at, well, what are the policy frameworks around assessment that can support the work?
What you're saying is really exciting. And in fact, you're ahead of many countries, including many global North countries, in being systematic about thinking about this and not just jumping to grab a framework that may or may not be appropriate for your region and your students. Hannah, as you look across the region beyond what's happening in these two countries, is this widespread, or are these two countries more lighthouses for others to follow?
No, thanks. I think in many regions, many countries, this is really the trend. I think it is not as easy as it sounds, especially because, as Shirley mentioned, there's different layers even within education system, from central government to provincial to districts, and different countries have different capacities. But also, especially for countries that UNICEF serve, as we look into how to assess better, how to teach better the actual quality element, many countries are still suffering from the hardware elements, whether it is school infrastructure. Can you deploy digital devices to schools, which really requires a lot of funding? And so if you don't have that approach that where you can do everything at once, then it really doesn't come all into one impact. So I think this is where many countries suffer as people try to improve the impact of education.
Punya, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. One of the things I was thinking of, I'm originally from India, and I remember when I was going to college, I was like 5 hours away from New Delhi, where my parents used to live. And to make a phone call, I'd have to go to this one place and, do this STD, the subscriber trunk dialing, where you give your number and then you come back after an hour or so, and hopefully you get through on a scratchy call line. And then, countries like India and Bangladesh and a lot of the world just jumped, into the cell phone age. And now we are looking at penetration of smartphones and things that way at a scale. In fact, I think it's like UNICEF data that I remember reading a while back, that more people have access to smartphones than to drinking water and clean toilets, which tells you something about our global priorities, maybe not as good as we would like them to be. But I think the broader point I'm making is that, now if you look at, things like that we've been talking about on this show with respect to the rise of these generative AI tools and the fact that 100 million people subscribe to these tools within a month or two of their being announced to the world. So the pace of penetration of these new technologies is happening at such a pace. And plus, I think the pandemic also pushed certain digital tools more into the realm of education than was before. So I'm just curious about how you are seeing, what are the trends on the ground with respect to these tools, that people using these tools in ways that may or may not be educational, but that whether educational systems are responding to these changes and what those changes look like on the ground. Because I know there's a lot of discussion here, for instance, right now about what these tools mean for education, both in K-12 and higher ed contexts. So I'm just curious to sort of look at how, just given the rapid pace at which technology now spreads across the globe, so how this is playing out in your particular context. I'd just be curious to learn more. But you can jump in and we can just do a round robin on that.
Want to go, Hannah?
Okay. For us in Kenya, technology is posing the challenge of learners carrying their phones into an examination room or an assessment room. That is the challenge number one. Challenge number two, not very many schools can afford to facilitate ICT lessons because some of them are located in ASAL and semi-arid and arid lands. Number three, the available resources may be ready for sharing, but the distances from one school to another where they need to access and share poses a challenge. Then lastly, we have the challenge of just phobia. Some teachers have never overcome. Some parents have never overcome technology. And then, of course, the most scary for us is the influence, the media influence, the negative impact of learners accessing wrong sites when they're using technology. And I think in essence, that is what we have, but the government is doing all that it can to increase the supplies, to build the capacity of the teachers, to create more awareness on the importance of using ICT and putting in safeguard measures so that learners can still access the gadgets, but do not get influence from the media. And back to you. Thank you.
Or maybe I can jump in. So in South Africa, there's we still have a huge challenge in terms of connectivity at the school level. So Wi-Fi access, internet access is really not ubiquitous. We don't have it across all schools. In fact, it's really in terms of many schools have access in the administration blocks, but not in the actual classrooms. And the schools that do have access to typically a range of other great resources as well. South Africa has what's been sort of termed a bimodal schooling system, where there's almost two parallel schooling systems, where a very small minority, and our listeners will understand, based on our historical kind of background, that there's a minority of schools that are very well off in terms of there's this sort of socioeconomic context, and that's very much aligned with racial lines, with and learning outcomes, and that's probably somewhere between 10 to 15, 20% of the country. The remainder of the country has a completely different set of learning outcomes and a huge number of challenges. And many of those schools don't have any internet connectivity or very little internet connectivity, and challenges around any kind of safety and security and daily use of hardware is a genuine challenge. So it's one of these really tough problems to get right. I think we had a lot of hopes that we would have been further down the line in terms of access to tech, access to connectivity at the school level than what we are. In terms of where the department is looking within their current thinking, there's a consideration that digital skills becomes grouped with the other foundational skills, so literacy, numeracy, digital skills, and some of the transversal skills, and that it's really prioritized. But the roadmap to implementation is really tricky. And it really just, we're saying that it contributes to this kind of equity issue that's really circular in the country. In terms of generative AI and everything that's been happening just in the last few months, there's a huge amount of talk. There's a lot of conversations happening in the sector. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of fear, and not a lot of know-how at this stage as to how to make this work locally.
If I may, yes, thank you. No, just because Punya's question was, how does it really look practically on the ground? I just wanted to make a few comments. One is that whether it is from the government, from the private sector, or people like us in the civil society side, there are a lot of trials, pilots, options. It is almost overwhelming. So the number of proposals that even at UNICEF we receive is varies. It's almost too much. The key question is, okay, out of all these options, which ones are really good? Which ones are really scalable? Which is actually one of the key issues that we suffer. Use of AI, great, especially for something quite complex and quite where you really need to look at various aspects. Use of AI is really, I think, is one of the solutions. But we do definitely worry about the digital divide. All these interventions that's happening, at the end of the day, the doers, they do want to see impact, they want to see results, and they want to gather data. So at the end of the day, they end up reaching not necessarily the most vulnerable. And that is a key issue that we're facing right now. We talk about use of technology for the most vulnerable, even those with disabilities. The fact is, there's not enough, I think, evidence and efforts to really reach those with disabilities. Even if there's one option, they may only be talking about visually impaired, not necessarily hearing impaired. How can we collectively use technology to really serve the most vulnerable is one of the key challenges on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you. Kurt?
Yeah, hi. It's been an interesting conversation so far. And I have 3 questions for you, but one of them you just answered. I was going to ask about challenges. And, your response, Hannah, in terms of scalability and impact, has been a common theme of Silver Lining for Learning. In fact, Chris, I think, has a book about scalability issues and so forth. So he might have a follow-up question for you or a way to elaborate on it for all 3 of you. But I want to ask one of my other 2 questions that I usually ask at the end of a show. And I sometimes don't get a chance to. So Punya's had several shows on school entrepreneurship, innovation in India. And so I've asked this question, but often with 30 seconds to go or even less. So I'd like each of you to think about what is your biggest win or success story or stories or something that people might want to hear about, and might be emotional, might not be, might sometimes we shed tears over some of these emotional wins, but I want you to think back and share what it's sure we have to overcome the challenges, but there should be wins along the way. Should be something we're striving towards and keep us going in this for all of us to keep coming up with new innovations in education. So Salome, Hannah, Shirley, would you like to jump in there?
Okay, thank you. Let me take it first. I think for me, from our country, Kenya, what we can really say is a success story that we would want to share is the fact that we started implementing competency-based curriculum long time from preschool. And then in addition to the curriculum, we also have the policy for ECD, pre-primary education. And then we developed the standard guidelines, which have gone a long way to help. Now, based on those three, it becomes very easy to farm the foundation. Then once you have done the farming of the foundation, it is very easy to inform what follows next. And then I think the use of our curriculum development institution, what we refer to as KICD, to continuously research and document, then share the findings, has given us an upper hand to move on despite the challenges. Thank you, and back to you.
What a lovely question, Kurt. I'm glad Salome went first because I felt I needed a moment to to reflect. I think for me, just personally, we started something called the Sandbox Schools Project a few years ago. And the idea there was, it's all good and well as an innovation unit in South African education, kind of mandated to kind of run alongside the ministry and learn quickly and share learnings, and you can learn a lot from secondary research. But we thought, let's take it one step further. Let's just put some of these ideas into practice in like a really participatory way. Let's prototype some of these ideas in like a tiny number of schools, so like 10, 11 schools, mostly rural township schools in South Africa. And we would collaborate with some academics and then some teachers and schools to figure out how, what the intervention would be. And they all were under this banner of breadth of skills, the 21st century skills. So we tried a few things. We tried tinkering. We tried mindfulness in schools, in classrooms. We tried something called the competency-based learning program, where teachers will help to get their lesson plans ready, but find opportunities to use their pedagogies to develop competencies and build, whether it was curiosity or critical thinking, into their lessons. So you're using your knowledge as the vehicle for developing these competencies. We did a bit of coding and robotics, not for the sake of coding and robotics, but for the sake of developing different ways of thinking and using different pedagogies to help think differently, help kids to collaborate and play and explore. And I think the thing that's probably been most moving to me is that work, where feedback from teachers, well, initially feedback is often, this is quite hard. It's harder than just having to deliver the content I needed to deliver. Like, I have to do all sorts of things. I have to actually develop the capacity myself a little bit, with some of these competencies. I have to, so it's a bit of a slow process, and there's a bit of pushback to get some of these going. But so often what we'd find is teachers would come back saying, they couldn't believe that kids seemed so kind of like delighted when they had the chance to do these things, when they had the chance to collaborate in ways that they weren't used to collaborating in, or when they were doing these little exercises that we were encouraging, and that they were trying these different pedagogies. And this thing around just kids experiencing joy and excitement and curiosity and delight when they're learning. I think that's probably been the most moving kind of part of it. And that's really just anecdotal. So that's probably for me one of the wins.
We've had an episode on mindfulness, and I think we've had one on joy, and it was maybe part of the same episode. So if anyone's watching this episode or listening, you might want to go back to the one that we had a couple of months ago, and with Dana Hendrickson and others, and folks at Arizona State, where Punya is. Hannah, you want to jump in?
Sure. Let me share an experience from Egypt. When I was Chief of Education there from UNICEF side. I surely briefly referred to it, but in the Middle East region, there was a framework called Competency Framework called Life Skills and Citizenship Education Framework, LSCE. And I was a task to contextualize the Egyptian country context. And it's really deriving from, this framework really derived from post-Arab Spring, young people all frustrated, a lot of very high youth unemployment, their voices not being heard, etc. So this LSD framework is not just talking about the cognitive development aspect, but it's also talking about the social aspect of youth skills development. So in a way, very luckily, many things, it often, the timing speaks a lot. When I joined Egypt country office, it was when the new minister came on board to the country. And he, after many months of discussions with the minister decided to take on this LSE framework as the fundamental concept of the education reform that he decided to initiate. So the framework, which comprised of 12 core skills, the country decided to adopt 2 more core skills. So it was a 14 skilled framework. The country decided to update the curriculum framework using that LSCE, but not adopt life skills as an independent subject, but really mainstream the 14 core skills in different subjects. Even in math, you can still teach collaboration, respect toward others through group work, for example. So it became a project-based curriculum from kindergarten. And this curriculum framework update was accompanied by teacher training framework, digital framework, and assessment framework. So it was a national framework that was going through, and different partners contributed to different elements. There was a huge national teacher training initiative where more than 1 million teachers were trained according to the new framework that was developed. A few years later, what was really moving was that I visited one of the rural areas and visited the school, talked to the teachers, talked to the parents, and they were quite honest, saying that initially they were very suspicious. Another one of the government initiatives that they're trying to change. Teachers are tired of teacher trainings. In general, I think many of the teachers are going through teacher training lethargy at the moment. And the parents were also doubtful. All of a sudden, students didn't have homework. What are they really learning? But after even 6 months or close to 1 year, they really started witnessing that children can do more than before. And the parents actually told me that they're learning a lot from the students, and the learners, their children. And I think we should never undermine the power of children impacting and influencing the parents and the caretakers at home. So that was quite a moving experience that I had. I think the reform was never perfect, of course, and the minister's leadership was very strong. So I think for a country like Egypt, where it's quite centralized compared to a country like South Africa, where it's very decentralized, and that actually adds additional challenges to implementing certain national initiatives. The approach in Egypt actually worked well at the time, but I think there was also a challenge in terms of looking at the political dimension, not just talking about the technical element of education reform.
Salome wants to add to a comment. While she's unmuting her mic, I'll just say it's a wonder that innovative pedagogies get children excited and create some changes. Learner-centered, active learning, collaborative learning, critical thinking, all the things we've been talking about are making a difference. So, it's been a theme across all 150 some shows. Salome, are you with us?
Yes, I am. So for us, we have broken the idea of competency into 3 specific concepts. We are keen on the knowledge, we are keen on the skill, and we are keen on the values or attitudes. So for us to realize that, out of research, the Directorate of Quality Assurance and Standards developed a tool that allows the officers to go to respective schools as a team. Then they do capacity building within that particular school. So when they go to school, they carry out assessment of the whole school, and then they do lesson observations using a Tangerine. It's an app that allows you to see a teacher teach within 30 or 40 minutes, and you generate a whole report concerning all the aspects of learning in class. Then when you discuss with the teacher, we have realized that is where the win is. The teachers get the concept very clear when it comes to stating specific learning outcomes, when it comes to infusing the values, infusing the competencies, infusing the pertinent and contemporary issues. So that has really given us a win when it comes to measuring how much are we winning the teachers, how much are we helping them. It's a very simple tool. We just use a laptop or a smartphone and you administer the assessment. Thank you. That's what we're doing. Back to you.
Sure. So it's always interesting to hear what the successes are and that you've had. I'm going to ask a related type of question. And I know Shirley's an alum of Harvard, and you're sitting there in one of Chris's class envisioning your future, what possible job roles you might have. And here you are. I don't know how many years later, maybe it's 6 months later, maybe it's a few years or longer. For people who might be watching the show again or listening to the podcast later on, they might be, thinking about their potential job roles in the future, and you might be great role models for one of them or a few of them. And what I'd like to do is a tangential question, the last one. I'd like for you to talk about what's a major surprise or eye-opener in a positive way in your current role during the past year or two. What's something that you discovered or you've been involved in, you never anticipated, but it's been good for you professionally growing, or something that they might look forward to doing in the future or tackling or taking on in terms of responsibilities that you didn't envision as a graduate student at Harvard or wherever else you happen to have gone. Who would like to address that first? And then after these round, Chris has a follow-up question.
I think something that's been really, I suppose, surprising in some ways and not in others. So our team had been working on this idea of breadth of skills for a long time. We had really come to understand it. And what I hadn't fully realized in the South African context was within our Ministry of Education, we have an incredibly dedicated, incredibly smart team. They are, if the South African population could have a sense of the hard work that goes on behind the scenes, the ministry is often criticized because we really battle with a number of our learning outcomes, and there's a lot of very real challenges. And it's easy to sort of point fingers. I think the thing that has been almost surprising to me, having worked much more closely with the ministry, is how committed and dedicated the teams are there, and how open to feedback the ministry is. So if you can position yourself somewhere in the ecosystem, whether it's writing policy briefs, whether it's pulling together evidence in a way that's digestible, understandable, relatable, whether it's running interventions and providing feedback in a way that decision makers can use this information. I think one of the bottlenecks is that, well, certainly in our local ministry, is that there's just not enough time to do everything that needs to be done. And where people and organizations and civil society and individuals can make a real difference is to provide some kind of digestible format of the evidence coming out of what we're learning, what innovations are working, what's not working, and making that available to decision makers in a way that's really useful. And certainly the South African ministry is open and available to that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for people wanting to work in sectors like education. And there's many different ways of doing such a thing. I often get asked the question, hey, I want to be part of education, but I don't want to be a teacher. And it's like, well, that's great, because there are tons of other different avenues. So I think that's been one thing that's been surprising and very welcome in my experience.
Thank you. Salome or Hannah?
Okay, once again, thank you. In the course of my discharging my services, I have come across 3 things that have really excited me. I never saw them come.
Salome, you might try putting the camera back on. I think you're coming in really clear now, and we might, with video, it might work. Just try it once. We'll see.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, I was explaining that I never foresaw 3 things coming into my life that are so exciting. One, when I went to the region, for a long time I was working at the national office. Then I discovered in the region where I went to work, we have some schools in the slums, and those people were working as independent organizations. So I was given the responsibility to mediate and bring them together so that we form one organization so that they speak from the same script. I've done that successfully, and I'm so excited about keeping peace and bringing people together as a mediator. It's about conserving the Mother Earth. I was given the responsibility to ensure that we plant as many trees and fruit trees, indigenous trees as we can. So I thought through and I realized if we just tell people plant trees, they will never plant. But if we partner with the other organization whose core mandate is about tree planting, then it will become very easy for them to help us. So for example, in Kenya, we have an organization that deals with the forestry. So we partnered with the organization that deals with the forestry and then the prisons, because they have land and they can generate very many seedlings. So our responsibility was for me to facilitate sending the seedlings to the respective schools and organizing that we have a specific day for tree planting. Then we also shared with our schools to work with the relevant organizations within their close proximity, like banks, like factories, to give back to the community by supplying enough seedlings. And I've seen it work so well. The last one, today, the way I am dressed, I'm coming from another very exciting meeting. It's about Silver Academy and a program for the old people, elderly. I thought when you get old, you just rest. But today I've discovered even the old can add value in life by giving them extra skills in terms of their physical ability, literacy skills, financial literacy. In fact, I have a list of 9 programs. So I've learned that even after this, I can engage in any of those activities. Thank you, and back to you.
Hannah.
I guess it's sort of a compilation of what Shirley and Salome mentioned, but I think when we're talking about young people, children and young people, this demographic dividend, they really need to be the baby of everyone, right? Whichever sector you're working for. I talked about this education reform in Egypt, but what's also happening in South Africa also, we need allies, not just within the education sector, but allies from beyond, especially the labor market, because ultimately that's the area where we're trying to generate effective human capital. So whichever sector you work for, it's easy to criticize what the government is trying to do, what the sector is trying to do, but it's really when you actually listen to the details of what's going on, the steps that the government people are going through, you actually understand that there's so many aspects from, for example, not just the education technical sort of curriculum engineering sort of discussions, but also how do you strategically communicate within the education sector, but also to the public, to the labor market, to various stakeholders? How do you deal with political dynamics within the country. Young people are also, we've been talking about what happens within the education sector, but they're also suffering from other social issues. Somebody mentioned about access to water, but access to vaccines, the health and nutrition aspect that affects human brain. Online violence is something, one of the key topics of late. These things need to be complementing what happens and what progress is made in the education sector. So I think everybody has a stake to play to really take care of the younger generations coming up that really supports and develops the country overall.
Thanks, Hannah and Shirley and Salome. Chris, back over to you.
So all of the co-hosts of this show are centered in learning technologies. And what keeps us up at night? There's three things that keep us up at night. One of them is that people buy a lot of learning technologies and then they don't use them. And we see this all over the world. People make investments in infrastructure, typically in hardware and software, and then it just sits. A second thing that keeps us up is that people use the technologies, but they use them poorly. And often using them poorly means that they use them to automate the industrial era model of schooling so that we have a faster way of doing the wrong thing. And the technology becomes a liability rather than an asset because we're using it to stuff more and more facts into students' minds. But the third thing that we worry about is that when it is used and when it's used well, that it's used inequitably and that it widens the gaps between groups in society and further disenfranchises marginalized groups because through issues of access, through issues of all the other kinds of barriers that we can imagine, it has an unfortunate outcome. And we've talked about these things a lot throughout Silver Lining for Learning, and probably the single investment that gives the most traction on all three of those problems is building teachers' capacity. At the end of the day, this is not about technology, it's about teachers. And if teachers are prepared well and have values that are oriented towards equity and empowerment, then they'll find a way to make the technology used effectively. So we don't have a lot of time left, but if each of you could talk a little about what you're proud of in terms of the kinds of teacher capacity building that you see happening in your country or region, that would be great.
Lumi, would you like to share on Kenya or?
Salome, you're muted. If you're talking, you're muted. Well, Hannah, why don't you go first? We'll reverse the order.
Sure. So I just want to pick the last point you mentioned about the equity piece, because that is for people like us, UNICEF, who talk about rights to education. This is where we push, and especially now in a context like South Africa, where there's a lot of very strong private sector, we talk about really realizing the collaboration. It's been said for decades, but I think it's time we really become serious about how you really collaborate at the equal level, not necessarily as a contributor to certain government initiatives, but as a equal partner among the public, private, and also youth, because they have a lot to say. Many of the good ideas actually come up from youth. So innovation, great. let's find out which ones are scalable, which ones really make the impact, but one stakeholder cannot do it alone. So this is where, I mean, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but I think it is true to really gather the brains out there that's available to really serve who we want to serve for.
I think just to build on that, and also to sort of bring it, align it with the conversation around breadth of skills in the Department of Basic Education in South Africa and their efforts over the last 12 to 18 months to understand how to manage educational change without it being a top-down experience has been really interesting. And so part of this has been this collaborative approach that you speak of, Hannah, across stakeholders, but the really interesting stakeholder has been with teachers. So right from the start, the department said, look, we've learned from various reforms, educational reforms in the past, and we're going to make sure that we're looping teachers in right from the start. So not only at the capacity building stage, but actually a few steps before that, and actually around the conceptualization stage. So in the conceptualization of this competency framework, teachers were the biggest stakeholder group that sat around across all provinces in the country and shared their experiences and their wishes and their intentions for learners that would be leaving and exiting the school system at the grade 12 level. And they have been the ones that have contributed to building out the conceptualization of South Africa's exploration around strengthening the curriculum and improving education. And I think so that's the one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is that the feedback from teachers is that whilst this is a curriculum strengthening process and the initial kind of catalyzing thing is adjustments to the curriculum, where the rubber hits the road is in the classroom and around teacher development. And the biggest recommendation we've had from South African teachers is that we cannot go about teacher capacitation and teacher development. I remember the phrase microwaving being used quite often. It can't be a microwave kind of thing. We need to think about this over the next decade. What is the picture around initial teacher education and continuous teacher development, and how are teachers engaged right up front to build out the picture for the picture for teacher capacitation? If this rebalancing of knowledge, skills, character and attitude and values is at play here, one of the first steps is to build that capacity within teachers, and that's not a slow process. So that's been the feedback that we've been getting.
Salome, do you have something to add?
I think I should add, for us in Kenya, we already have structures. The way our ministry operates, besides the Ministry of Education, we also have a commission strictly for teacher interest. We have the Teacher Service Commission that deals with those issues of the teachers. So continuously, they have programs to enhance the teachers' capacity. Then for the Ministry of Education, we have different directorates that also offer to build the capacity of teachers in different areas. For example, in terms of quality, we are very keen on building the capacity of teachers in curriculum development area. So they take part in that, we involve them. In terms of supervising the implementation of the curriculum, in terms of evaluation of the curriculum, and then we work so hard to improve on their content mastery and pedagogy, which involves use of ICT. So with that kind of elaborate teacher support system, the teachers in the country are able to improve themselves. And finally, there is an incentive for the teachers. When you upgrade yourself in terms of going back to school and then you learn more, like from certificate to diploma, there's an incentive. You move from diploma to the first degree, there is an incentive. You move from the degree to master's level, there is an incentive. So that way, the systems are put in a way that they are meant to propel the teachers as they acquire more capacities. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we are tight on time, but I just wanted to just quick comment, Hannah, on something that you said that I think is like very relevant. And often when we talk about education, we don't speak about the broader context within which it's happening, that the health and well-being of the children becomes critical to what happens within the school system. So whether it is vaccines or it is drinking water or it's like food and exercise and so on. So I think that very often when we talk about education, we focus on the school and the teacher within that context. But I think recognizing that any development and change that needs to happen is a broader societal activity, which ups the scale of it, makes it much more difficult, but not recognizing it also, I think, puts too much of a burden on the educational system or the individual teacher within a particular classroom. So I just wanted to highlight and underscore, I think, the point that you made. So thank you for that. Chris, I think we are on time to introduce the next episode.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for coming and sharing the exciting things that are happening in the African region. I think one of the things we've tried to do in Silver Lining for Learning is to highlight innovations and to celebrate initiatives happening in regions and countries that often don't receive much attention. And there is a lot of curiosity about what's happening in Africa and many good things to talk about. So we really appreciate the three of you coming to do that. Next week, there will not be a Silver Lining for Learning episode. Your co-hosts are taking a week off to celebrate the middle of summer. But in 2 weeks, we will have a show about an initiative that I learned about this spring when teaching a workshop on scale at Harvard, and one of the groups that participated was called Little Bookmates. It's a very exciting concept about lending libraries in native languages that can really dramatically affect kids' literacies in global South countries and also in global North countries. So keep an eye open for Little Bookmates at noon 2 weeks from today. And we wish all of you a happy summer.